This video is sponsored by Only Crits. Earlier this week, I started a new video series about structuring your campaign, and throughout this series, I'm going to spend a lot of time comparing D&D campaigns to TV shows. And with most of these examples, we're going to be looking at specific advice and lessons we can learn from specific TV shows, like looking at how a given series handles serialization or creates conflict centered on the characters, that sort of thing. But before we dig into all that, today we're just going to talk about the broad, holistic idea of modeling your campaign's structure on a TV show. Because this is actually an idea that popped up in the new Dungeon Master's Guide when they discussed how to go about preparing and running your campaign. So let's see what kind of advice they have for us. And in the spirit of modeling things after TV shows, I'm kind of hoping to keep this episode under 22 minutes, although I don't have high hopes for that.
Don't forget me.
Oh.
I can help.
Hi, Oddwick. If you missed the last episode, this is Oddwick, the algorithm wizard.
I'm here to help your channel grow.
Yeah, is that a Power Rangers reference? I meant to ask earlier, when you say make your channel grow, are you doing Power Rangers?
I'll never tell.
All right. Well, yeah, you're saying you can help me keep this episode under 22 minutes, right?
Oh no, I meant I could make this more like a TV show.
How would you do that?
Like this. Super Geek Mike is filmed in front of a live studio audience.
What? No, it's not. No, kill the laugh track. Look, Oddwick, do you think you could give me a few minutes to actually talk about the topic people came here to hear about?
You've got it.
We can all just pretend that opening title sequence didn't happen, right? Okay. Anyway, as we touched on in my last video, the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide offers a full chapter of advice about structuring your campaign, and they specifically make a comparison to a TV show or a series of comic books. They argue that a D&D adventure is like a self-contained story, like the kind you might get in a single TV episode or a comic, but that they all contribute to a larger story. And first of all, I'd love to know what comic books they're reading where they're still getting single, self-contained stories and individual issues, because while I've been out of that hobby for a while, I can say that within the last decade, it's felt like a lot of stuff was written for the trade. That's something I talked about on my video essay channel just recently. But still, their point stands. D&D campaigns are assembled from a collection of adventures. And then, a bit further into the chapter, the book offers some more specific advice about how your adventures might fit together. And the two examples they give are very clearly inspired by TV. Episodic adventures, or serialized adventures. With episodic adventures, each adventure is basically a standalone quest. Villains don't continue to menace the party after they've been dealt with, although I'd argue there are lots of episodic TV shows where villains can return again. Superhero cartoons do this all the time, and even episodic cop dramas might still have an old criminal return for another episode a few seasons later. But the point is, with an episodic campaign, you don't typically have a clear big bad playing an active role throughout multiple different adventures. The book also makes a great point that an episodic campaign is probably a much better approach if your group doesn't play frequently or consistently. If your players can't really remember all the details of your last session because it was 3 or 4 months ago, it's not a big deal because each new adventure is a clean slate. This is definitely the approach that Matt Colville encouraged in his video from last year, which was all about how it's preferable to run a bunch of short adventures rather than these long ones that you never get a chance to finish because they take so long to get through. And we can also see how this approach fits with his advice about making sure your game has downtime. Because the designers make clear in the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide, each new adventure can take place any amount of time after the previous entry. It could pick up right after, or it could take place weeks later, or months later, or even years later. And with a gap between adventures, you can work with your players to figure out what they got up to in between sessions. And you can move the world forward in such a way that helps you justify a new adventure or a new villain. This does mean you basically need to give your players a new plot hook with each new adventure to try to entice them to go on a new quest in every session, and that can be a bit of a challenge, although it gets easier the longer you play with the same group. On the other hand, your game could have a more serialized approach, where the story really works best if each adventure directly leads into the next one. This doesn't mean there won't ever be any time jumps. If we look at something like Game of Thrones, that show was heavily serialized, but sometimes the storyline would jump ahead by a week or a month because the characters were just traveling and nothing interesting was happening to them in between episodes. This was all in the early seasons before the characters all developed magical teleportation powers. Christ, the end of that show was so lazy. Also, this heavily serialized approach to a campaign doesn't mean you can't still do downtime activities in between sessions. If you watched my most recent episode of Critical Role Demystified, you know that sometimes the players will roleplay things at the table that I think could have just been handled as downtime in between sessions. But in a serialized adventure, no matter how much time has passed in the game between sessions, the characters are still assumed to be dealing with the same core storyline. Maybe in one session, the players saw a spooky masked figure flee from a fight, but they noticed he had a distinctive tattoo. You might resume the next session with the players having been looking into that tattoo in between sessions, trying to learn more about this mysterious enemy who escaped the fight. And when the next game opens, it could have been 2 weeks for the characters, but they're still plugged into the same story. This section of the book actually offers a short list of suggested ways to link adventures together to help reinforce the connections needed to sell a serialized story. For example, a major villain can flee to the next adventure location, and the players have to find them or chase them. Or maybe a villainous faction enters the story through some agents spying on the heroes or interfering with their plans. That's always a solid approach. Or the players might find a piece of treasure that basically begs some new questions that lead to another aspect of the larger mystery. That's honestly half the examples they give. This list only has 6 suggestions, but don't worry, we're going to talk about a lot of different kinds of serialized storytelling this year. So we'll talk about a bunch of different ways to connect different adventures together. And speaking of downtime, this book also recommends you take the time every once in a while to run what they call break episodes. Every 3 or 5 levels, they suggest give the players a break. A low-stakes session or adventure that has nothing to do with the overarching plot or broader perils, close quote. Examples are things like an episode to just handle the logistics of your bastion, or a carnival episode, or a shopping episode, or a vacation episode, or just a low-stakes quest like finding a missing pet. One of the examples they list is creature comedy. The characters encounter monsters with a comedic flavor, such as flumps, pixies, fairy dragons, or chatty mimics, in a situation that leads to mischief and humor rather than combat. And look, I haven't watched a lot of Star Trek, but I know the trouble with tribbles when I hear it. And these are fine, any of these can be fun, but I think you need to make sure your players know this is what's coming before the session actually arrives. For example, if we look at Campaign 1 of Critical Role, the Vox Machina campaign, they did do an episode just set at a Winter's Crest festival, which was their equivalent of Christmas. And it was their last game of the year, and this was a tradition in their home games where they'd dress in their PJs, and the characters would just go to a winter carnival. Plus, at the end of the previous session, the characters were invited to the festival by the grateful townspeople they just saved from vampires. So they sat down for that last session of 2015 knowing it was basically just going to be funnel cakes and bobbing for apples. And most of the other times when the party took a break and f***ed around for an episode, it was dictated by the players. They were the ones deciding to do a shopping episode, or a hot springs episode, or a beach episode. But if you know in advance that you're expecting an episode to be a break episode, you should probably heavily telegraph that at the end of the session beforehand, so the players aren't disappointed when they sit down to the table. There's absolutely nothing wrong with just taking a session to f*** around and do nothing and just enjoy a fictional holiday, as long as nobody's expecting anything different.
This little guy was crazy for Christmas. We used to wrap his presents in lead foil so he couldn't peek.
You mean Santa wrapped them?
Oh, of course, dear.
Hey, Odwick.
Yes?
Why can't I say f***?
It's the TV show
Because
episode.
It's the TV episode, right? I realized that as soon as I said it. You can't curse in a TV episode. Yep, checks out. Okay, thank you, Odwick.
You got it.
Now, the book also very briefly mentions the idea that you could go back and forth between these formats, drop some episodic adventures in between serialized adventures. We're not talking about these break episodes where not much happens, but literally just an episodic adventure in the middle of a serialized game. They suggest doing this to help satisfy your players, if not all of them are looking for the same thing from their D&D campaign. For example, if you got players who really wish the game wasn't so serialized because they're getting burnt out, adding in a standalone episode will help them feel like they're not just spinning their wheels. But I actually don't think that's the best reason to do this. Not because it's a bad reason, but because I think there's a better reason. To be clear, I think it is a great idea to run a serialized campaign that has some episodic adventures peppered in every once in a while. After all, we see that a lot on Critical Role, especially during the Vox Machina campaign. When the party is in Vasselheim, they take the time to do a one-shot adventure set in Pyra to complete part of Keyleth's Rite of Passage. Before the Briarwood arc gets off the ground, the party has to go deal with a gigantic bird stealing cows from the farms outside of Amon. Before they leave for the Feywild, an old enemy ambushes them and they have to spend a session focused on that. Variety is the spice of life, and this is an awesome way to keep the players from just feeling bogged down by always dealing with these long adventures that take a few months to complete at least. So if you just drop a one-off adventure on them every once in a while, the players get an easy win to bolster their spirits. Plus, it's a great way to handle missing players, like how they couldn't deal with Percy's backstory because Taliesin was gone, so they had to go save some cows. Or you can use these one-shots to do a one-off adventure with a guest player. There's a few excellent examples of that in Critical Role's second campaign. Maybe the one-off adventure is focused on that guest player, as happened with Mark Holmes' character, or maybe they're just along for the ride on this one-shot, as was the case with Deborah Ann Wool. But these are both perfect examples of episodic adventures that occurred in the middle of a very serialized campaign. However, I don't think the reason to do this is necessarily because your players want different things from the campaign, because I think you should make sure your players know the format of your campaign before they sign on, or at the very least, before they get too deep into it. You need to make sure your players know the format of the game they're currently playing in. Which actually brings me to another resource I want to talk about today, which also has some useful advice for thinking about your campaign like a TV show.
But first, a word from our sponsor.
What? Wait, that's not usually how we do things around here. Dice. 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 Dice by Only Crits. Visit onlycrits.com/supergeek and use the promo code SUPERGEEK to save 12% off your order. Link in the description. For dice. What the hell was that?
A commercial for the TV show episode.
Okay, fine. Normally I do more of a segue to get into an ad, but it's fine. Anyway, let's get back to the video, please. Now, like I was saying, there is another resource that has a lot of useful advice for how you can structure your campaign to be more like a TV series. I mentioned this on the channel in the past. Chris Perkins, one of the lead adventure designers on the D&D team, used to write a column on the Wizards of the Coast website called The Dungeon Master Experience. And in March of 2011, he wrote an article called My Campaign, the TV Series. He starts by drawing some connections between D&D campaigns and serialized TV shows. You've got a cast of ensemble characters, which was especially common in shows of that era, like Lost or Battlestar Galactica. You've got the format we just discussed. The campaign is made up of smaller adventures, some of which are standalone, while others are built around a larger mythology. And finally, while the episodes are still the core of the campaign, there's also still room for the characters to develop and be the stars of the show. And some characters could even die, which happens in D&D and could absolutely happen in a lot of these serialized shows. And then, I just want to read this next paragraph because it is a beautiful time capsule. In fact, the only real difference I can ascertain between a D&D campaign and a serialized TV drama is that, unlike a TV show, a D&D campaign isn't likely to be televised. Having said that, I dare someone to prove me wrong. I will pay tribute and homage to anyone who actually manages to turn his or her D&D campaign into a TV series. Yeah, Chris from 14 years ago? I'd say someone managed to pull that off. So then Chris offers 3 tips for how to make your D&D campaign feel like a TV show. The first is to keep a running episode guide, basically a brief written summary of each session. Each session is a numbered episode in your campaign, and you also give it a title after the fact. If they didn't finish the adventure and the game ended on a cliffhanger, just slap a part 1 on the end of the episode name and treat that as a 2-parter. And then write up a brief summary of what happened in that session. You don't need to get into the nitty-gritty, but just include the basics of what happened. He recommends using a wiki for these guides because it's just easier to keep track of things that way. But I will add that there's another bonus to using a wiki, which is that you can share these links with your players, so they can read along with the episode recaps if they want. Chris also suggests using a notes section at the bottom where you can include whatever things you need to keep track of. The example he gives is that a character had prayed to his god for aid, so that should probably matter in a later session. Now that could potentially work against the idea of sharing these wikis with your players, but there are absolutely services where you can still write up an episode guide for your players, but also include notes that only you can see. One of those websites is a frequent sponsor of mine, although they're not sponsoring this video, but they're definitely going to come up in a lot of upcoming installments in the series, so you're going to hear me talk about this again with some more specifics, I'm sure. Chris's next piece of advice is to think of your campaign in terms of seasons. This article was written during the days of 4th edition, which actually went all the way up to level 30, so Chris planned 3 seasons for his campaign, each one lasting 10 levels, since those were the 3 tiers of play for 4th edition. But he also makes it very clear that his players have already committed to being a part of his campaign for a long time, so he doesn't have to worry about the game falling apart before they get through all 3 seasons. But if your gaming group isn't that stable, he doesn't recommend that approach. Now, 5th edition has 4 tiers of play. Levels 1 through 5, levels 6 through 10, levels 11 through 15, and levels 16 through 20. And with each tier, your character is assumed to gain some more notoriety and influence, meaning you would basically have a new status quo when your party reaches each of these thresholds. So I think these are a very natural fit for the seasons of a D&D campaign. This doesn't mean that you have to use these tiers. Depending on your group and your players, One season could run from levels 1 through 10 as you run them through a pre-published adventure like Curse of Strahd. Or a season could be just 2 or 3 levels because you plan to run a campaign that will only take a month or 2 to play through. But if you're following what so many of us imagine as the platonic ideal of a D&D campaign, starting at level 1, going until level 20, then I think 4 seasons is at least a good starting point to brainstorm ideas for your campaign. You can then go back in and break it down into smaller seasons if you want. For example, the Vox Machina campaign could probably be broken down into 1 or 2 seasons for the home game, and then at least 4 or 5 for the streamed game, maybe even 6, meaning their level 1 to 20 campaign can be divided into anywhere from 5 to 8 seasons. But if it's looking like an adventure is going to be long enough that it would take more than a few sessions, like the Briarwood arc, for example, then you could just decide that 1 season will run for just a few levels. After all, the Briarwood arc literally was a season of television, and it only ran for like 3 or 4 levels at most, so they don't all have to run for the exact same number of levels or the same number of sessions. Now, in a lot of his videos, Matt Colville has discussed how he considers the end of level 5 to basically be the end of book 1 of a campaign, and then the group takes a break, like a hiatus between seasons, one might say, before jumping into the next book. But I personally find the idea of framing these tiers as TV seasons to be a lot more useful than imagining them as books, because, as Colville argued in his video about adventure length, a campaign can be a series of disconnected adventures, and a TV season is a much better match for that format. But also, he's often prepared for the possibility that book 1 will be the end of the campaign. And so if you could end your season with some closure, then if your campaign gets cancelled, aka the game falls apart, then at the very least the players will feel like there was some resolution and won't suffer under the weight of an endless cliffhanger. But this also gets into the idea that each season can essentially be a new story, which is something we're going to talk about a lot more throughout a lot of videos this year. But this is something that I think is pretty important to running your games with seasons in mind. You have to act as if each season might be your last. Most TV showrunners are fully aware that the season they're currently working on could be the last one they ever get to run, due to events that are fully out of their hands. Likewise, if you can build these off-ramps into your campaign where your players can feel like there's this sense of victory as they finish a storyline, then if your campaign does get cut short, then the fact that you used a seasonal approach to the campaign means you have a much better chance of making sure your game ends on some sort of closure. That's probably one of the biggest benefits of imagining your campaign as a TV show. You just imagine the game might get canceled in any minute. That way you don't try to save all your cool ideas for a later date your players might never reach. You just focus on doing the coolest shit you can. And just like with a TV show, hopefully doing a bunch of cool shit as often as possible will make it a lot less likely that your game will fall apart, because your players will want to keep coming back every week. Returning to this article, Chris Perkins also takes advantage of these season hiatuses to do something else really cool. He asks each player for a list of 3 things they'd like to see happen during the campaign. These could be character specific, like getting a cool magic item, or experiencing some sort of magical transformation, or falling in love. Or they could be broader. The example Chris gives is when a player requested the party fight in a full-scale naval battle in the next season. But then we get Chris's next piece of advice, and I think it's really interesting. He suggests you imagine where your campaign is going, and concoct future episode ideas. Now, at first glance, this just sounds like planning out the entire campaign before you start playing, and even though that's something I've done a bunch of times, I think it's bad advice. I've planned out some awesome level 1 to 20 campaigns in my head, but that approach has never served me well when it actually comes to running individual sessions. However, Chris isn't saying you should map out your entire campaign in advance. His suggestion is instead to start writing up 1-sentence descriptions for episodes that haven't happened yet. It's similar to when showrunners break a season of TV. So if it helps, I would recommend you don't think of it the way Chris describes it, where you map out ideas for your campaign. Instead, think of this as mapping out ideas for your season. Keep your attention focused on just the few levels ahead of you. Here are some examples from Chris's campaign. The first 3 were more fleshed out since he expected to run them in the very near future. The Red Shoals of Dakar, Armos episode. The hunt for Fathom Reaver leads the heroes to an elemental domain ruled by greedy pirates and bloodthirsty politics. Master of the Maelstrom, Demos and Vargas episode. The heroes confront their nemesis, the pirate warlord Vantajar, on the high seas. Impstinger Must Die, Demos episode. Sea King Impstinger is accused of launching a savage attack on a Dragavar settlement. And then he gives 2 more examples that are a bit more loosely sketched out, just to show the raw material he starts with, when these are literally just a very simple blurb. Defective, Fleet episode. The characters are reunited with their Warforged companion, but there's something different about him. Constellation of Madness. A celestial event alters reality, allowing heroes from the Monday campaign to interact with heroes from the Wednesday campaign. A few notes about these. First of all, he gives each of these concepts a cool name. That's absolutely optional, you don't have to do that. But I will admit, it seems fun. I've really enjoyed naming game sessions myself. It can be a really fun exercise, and maybe we'll talk about naming sessions in another video. But I have to admit, the idea of coming up with names for future sessions would help me get excited about them, and maybe make them stick in my head a little bit better. Second, he later admits the idea of combining his groups is a logistical nightmare, so that one is probably never going to happen. I'd imagine if it doesn't, he might still use that title for something, because Constellation of Madness is a terrific episode name. But third, as we can see from that final example, some of these ideas focused on a specific player and others did not, because presumably they would impact the entire group equally and nobody's character would specifically be the focus of that session. Now just because an episode is focused on a certain character, that definitely doesn't mean the other characters wouldn't get to contribute in a meaningful way. But this approach does seem really similar to how Matt Mercer ran the Vox Machina campaign. In that game, I could totally imagine Matt making a note that there would be a Keyleth episode focused on her Aramente, and a Vex and Vax episode where they meet their dad in the Feywild, and a Scanlan episode when he gets seduced by his daughter. If you haven't kept up with my Critical Role Demystified videos, or you haven't watched the cartoon, don't worry, that's not quite as bad as it sounds. Although it is still quite bad. The main difference between Chris's approach and Matt's approach is that, with very few exceptions, Matt tends to structure the Vox Machina campaign so an entire story arc will be focused on a character rather than just individual episodes. But the core idea is the same. You mine a character's backstory or flaws or status quo for drama, and then you deploy a story that gives everyone interesting stuff to do but shines a light on one character in particular. And then you make sure everyone else knows that this campaign isn't just the Percy show or the Grog show. Everybody's going to get their turn in the spotlight. Everybody will be the focus character at some point. In fact, right at the top of the article, Chris explains that this is the purpose of this exercise. He finds that the biggest benefit of thinking of your campaign like a TV series is that it helps you put the focus where it belongs, on the player characters, and specifically on their ongoing development. However, this is exactly why it's important to use the right TV show as reference, because the reason you're looking at any given TV show is going to dramatically impact what lessons you take away from it. For example, while so many of us want these long, sweeping, elaborate campaigns like the kind we see on Critical Role, maybe we should actually be focused on running shorter campaigns, more like what we might see on Dimension 20, because it's really easy to lose momentum on these long campaigns. If the game falls apart, then it will feel like really no progress was made. But if we structure our games more like TV shows, we can borrow the format of a television season, a self-contained story, maybe with disconnected episodic adventures or maybe all telling one long story. But then we should probably be ready to resolve that story and maybe even give everyone a little hiatus so they can do some downtime. There's a great Matt Colville video about that as well. And then when you resume the game, you can decide if you want to pick up with the same characters and explore some old plot threads, or play with new characters or even in a new system entirely. Or you can turn the reins over to someone else to run games for a few months while you get your ducks in the row for the next story arc. But to be honest, that's just one possible structure. And if you've watched as much TV as I have, you know that there are a ton of different ways to structure a TV show, which means the landscape of television offers tons of different formats we can steal for our own games. In his video about adventure length, Matt Colville talks about how he thinks a great campaign is made up of a bunch of disconnected adventures all set in the same local area and starring the same characters, essentially like an episodic TV show like Columbo. But that's not the only way to run your campaign. Maybe instead the adventures are all still episodic, but instead of all being set in a local area, these are quests the heroes encounter as they make their way across the land, the Star Trek format. Or maybe they're traveling across the land, but they're working towards this one big goal, which they'll try to achieve in the finale of the campaign, like Avatar: The Last Airbender. Or maybe your campaign is made up of smaller story arcs. Those are your seasons. And each of these is focused on a new central storyline or big bad, like Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Maybe you stick with episodic adventures, but you slowly tease a larger storyline, like, honestly, like a whole lot of my favorite shows. Or maybe you really are just telling one huge continuous story, like those mega adventures. But the point is, there are a ton of different ways for you to format your campaign, and using TV shows is a really helpful way to visualize some of them. And more importantly, using TV shows helps you figure out what you like most about long-form storytelling. I tend to really like stories that have a lot of serialization, or at the very least have some sort of progress being made toward a big bad or a final goal. It's why I love shows like Lost, with slow burn mysteries that unfold week after week, or The Spectacular Spider-Man and its 3-episode long mini-arcs, or basically any Freak of the Week show that has a big bad at the end of a season. But not every D&D campaign should be a long, sweeping adventure. These days, TV shows are getting shortchanged with these ridiculously short seasons. Like, regardless how you feel about the episodes themselves, a season of Doctor Who with only 8 episodes should be illegal. But ironically, we probably should structure our games more like a TV show with a shorter season. This goes doubly so for published campaigns. For example, let's say you started running a Curse of Strahd campaign, and then you had a baby. Your campaign is now just lingering in limbo while you figure out your new life and your new schedule. But if you could structure your campaign so there are breaks in the action, essentially mini finales, like season finales, that are still satisfying to the players, then that would make it a lot easier to handle when the game has to go on hiatus for a while. But again, I like TV shows with a high degree of serialization, so that's what I bring to my games. On the other hand, Chris Perkins likes the way a TV show can expand on a character's journey, so that's what he prioritizes. But here's the thing. It doesn't just matter what you like about these shows. It also matters a lot which shows you actually choose to use as reference. When Chris Perkins talks about how TV has the power to focus on characters, and specifically their ongoing development, his words, that's honestly one of the clearest signs that this article was written in 2011. Chris's main points of reference in this article are serialized drama shows from the 2000s. And honestly, that was kind of the perfect time for TV shows to inspire our D&D campaigns. On the one hand, each episode of a given show was focused on the characters learning and growing, and the characters would actually change a lot over the course of a season, let alone over the life of a series. And this was kind of the first time this was true about so many TV shows. Think about almost any show from the 50s and 60s all the way up through the 90s. They were usually designed to air forever, and for the audience to drop into any episode at any point without getting confused. So the characters stayed relatively static. If you drop into any episode of Star Trek, Captain Kirk is the same guy. Maybe we might get the sense that the events of an episode really affected him, like an episode ends with him sadly contemplating human nature or whatever, but for the most part, he wasn't likely to bring it up again in another episode as a way to demonstrate what he'd learned, because they didn't assume the audience had seen every episode. Likewise, Lucy from I Love Lucy might regret her shenanigans every week, but she's still gonna do something crazy in the next episode. She'll always have some splaining to do. Now, that doesn't mean that these shows aren't still useful to draw inspiration from. Matt Colville compared an episodic TV show, like Columbo, to a campaign of D&D because he felt it was a useful example for connecting unrelated adventures together. And if you're not terribly worried about your characters having arcs and getting time in the spotlight, then something like Columbo or Murder, She Wrote or Monk or Psych is a perfectly fine point of reference for episodic adventures. But Chris Perkins' argument was that an episodic TV show is a useful point of reference because it puts the focus on the characters and their arcs. But that depends a lot on the show. Sure, some TV characters would gradually change over time. Chandler on Friends is a lot more emotionally mature after 10 seasons, but not every single Chandler storyline in every single episode is going to move his story forward. He evolved pretty slowly over the course of several seasons. And typically, it's pretty rare for the lessons learned in any given episode of a classic TV show to actually carry through and change the character's behavior in any meaningful way. Even on Friends, Chandler was the exception. Monica and Phoebe changed the least. Rachel matured a little bit, but she was still pretty much the same character at the end of the show. Ross got worse, and Joey still had his moments of maturity, but he was basically so goofy at the end of the show, they still thought they could build a whole sitcom around him because he had changed so little. Because sitcom characters generally need to be pretty static. Most of the time, if a character on a sitcom learns an important lesson at the end of an episode, it's not going to radically change their characterization. If it does, there's usually a lot of fanfare around it. It's a very special episode. Otherwise, any given lesson can't completely change who they are. They still have to be the same person every week so the writers can keep the same status quo in place.
Oh, man. We're doing this story again? How many times have we done this, Matt? 100,000?
He's yelling again. Stop the yelling.
You know, how can I learn so much every week and still be so stupid?
I think about that clip all the time. It lives rent-free in my head. It has for decades because it is the perfect summary of so many episodic stories where it doesn't matter what the characters learn at the end of the episode. They rarely actually change all that much. But that wasn't true for episodes of, like, Lost. If a character learned a lesson on that show, it was gonna matter. This didn't mean the character never repeated their old mistakes, but when they did, it felt like a tragedy, where they were really backsliding into their old toxic habits. However, the 2010s and late 2000s was still the era where these shows actually still got long seasons, where you had to come up with a bunch of episode ideas. But with streaming and the binge-watching model and inflated budgets across the board, we started getting much shorter seasons for a lot of these shows. So in most cases, not all, but most, TV seasons started telling one story broken up into anywhere from 6 to 12 chunks. The most common criticism of a lot of the streaming MCU shows is that these seasons of TV just feel like 6-hour movies rather than actual TV shows where each episode tells a distinct story. And those are hardly the only shows where that's the case. That's really common for a lot of shows created for streaming services. So because of that trend, a lot of modern shows are a lot more plot-driven rather than feeling character-focused like Battlestar Galactica or Mad Men. Like, I enjoyed The Acolyte more than a lot of people did, but in the final episodes of the season, the characters started doing things that didn't feel totally earned or didn't make sense, because the writers were rushing to get the characters into the position they needed to be in for the finale. The same goes for something like the final season of Game of Thrones, although personally I think that show was a much worse offender. That show started performing character assassination in its last few seasons, whereas The Acolyte mostly just felt rushed. But either way, that's the kind of attitude you're more likely to get with the current TV model, where so many seasons are just telling one serialized story. So that's why I actually think the advice, look at a TV series as an example for your campaign structure, really works best if you're focusing on specifically prestige dramas and genre shows from the 90s and the 2000s. Thankfully, that's my bread and butter, so I'm going to have a lot of recommendations in these departments. In fact, that's actually what we're going to talk about in the next video. We're going to talk about the movies and TV shows and books that I use as inspiration for my D&D games. And I think that video should be out on Sunday if all goes according to plan. If not, it'll be out on Monday. And then next week, we're actually going to take a look at some advice about getting started with your campaign. I think that's going to be a ton of fun. So if you want to see all these videos as soon as they come out, make sure to like and subscribe. Hey, Odwick?
Yes?
I made it through my TV show episode. Can I please have my cursing back?
Not yet. There's one more thing we've got to do.
Oh God, what is it?
This program was made possible thanks to contributions from viewers like you.
That's actually true. Yeah, I mean, thank you so much to everyone who supports me on Patreon. It really does mean a lot to me. This channel and everything I'm doing truly could not exist if it wasn't for your support. Thanks, Oddwick. I could stand to be a little more sincere from time to time. What's happening? Why are we fading to black? Is this you? Are you doing this? Are we doing another bit now? Uh-oh. Critical failure. The DM hasn't looked over at me yet. I could change my die result and he wouldn't know.
Not so fast.
Oddwick!
We play games with dice for a reason. Chance and luck are an important part of the game. If you cheat, you're only cheating yourself out of the experience of allowing something really cool to happen that you weren't expecting. Plus, none of the other players are cheating, so it's not fair to them to change your die roll.
You're right. DM, I rolled the natural 1. You're killed immediately. Well, at least I know that's what would have happened, because I played fair. Thanks, Oddwick.
Now you know, and knowledge is the key to unlocking the mysteries of the multiverse.
Yeah! Thank you, Oddwick.
Absolutely. See you next time.
In the next thrilling episode of Super Geek Mike, Mike shares the art that inspires him. But what did he leave out?
I've never actually read The Lord of the Rings.
Followed by a very special episode of the Super Geek Academy, a tribute to the most important men in Mike's life.
Well, that's a little misleading.
Tears will be shed. You don't wanna miss this. Sunday, January 12th at 10 a.m. Pacific, only on YouTube.
Well... Oh, come on.